Hey everybody, tonight's video is called Now You Earned It, Job. And tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Job. We're going to be looking at the 38th chapter. And we're going to be looking now, as the book of Job closes, we're going to see that God responds to Job. And if you remember from earlier studies, that Job requested God time in court. And now we're going to see almost like God has brought Job into court as a prosecutor. So God will have his day in court with Job, and God will interrogate Job now as Job raised some accusations against God. And the Lord's going to confront Job, we're going to see in these next couple chapters. And God will expose the weakness and the foolishness of Job. So Job chapter 38 verse 1 says, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me." So Job repeatedly called God to court in order to verify his innocence. And God finally came to interrogate Job on some of his comments that he has made to his own accusers. And God was about to be Job's vindicator, but he first brought Job to a right understanding of himself. And we see this whirlwind was likely associated with the storm that Elihu saw coming in the last chapter. And it's amazing to me that God was absent from the account in the last 35 chapters. And, God wasn't absent, but God didn't speak in the last 35 chapters. And we read nothing about God's direct role in comforting, speaking to, or sustaining Job in the midst of his crisis over these past 35 chapters. And over that time, Job has ached repeatedly for a word from God. But we see that God doesn't immediately or directly answer Job's friends, but he does to Job. And the whirlwind in Old Testament is often associated with the divine presence. And back in the book of 2 Kings chapter 2, God brought Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind, if you remember that story. And Psalm 77 verse 18 shows God's presence is in the whirlwind. In the book of Isaiah 66 verse 15, it shows God's coming like a whirlwind. And in Ezekiel 1 verse 4, God appeared to Ezekiel in a whirlwind. So we see a whirlwind is very significant when it comes to the presence of God in the Old Testament. And Job's words had only further confused matters that already confused by useless counselors, or his useless three stooges of friends that I call them. And God accused Job of speaking without knowledge. And take note that God never told Job about the reason for his pain or the comfort or the conflict with Satan, which was the reason for Job's suffering. And notice that God never gave Job any explanations at all about the circumstances of his trouble. And, when we go through different trials and everything, God does not owe us answers. And instead, God asked Job if he was eternal, if he was great, powerful, wise, and perfect as God. And if not, Job would have been better off to be quiet and to trust him. And so verse 4 through 7 says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy? Or who shut in the sea with doors, when it burst forth and issued from the womb? When I made clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band." So, creation is spoken of using the language of building construction. And the morning stars, or the sons of God in verse 7, are the angelic realm, God's ministering spirits. And God is the sovereign creator of the earth. And essentially what God is saying to Job is if he, hold on, I had this little mixed up right here. God says to Job, answer these things, and then he would be fit to question God. And if he couldn't answer these questions, then he had no place to question God. And in verse 4, I'm going to reread verse 4. It says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. So verse 4 reminds us that God indeed laid the foundations of the earth as the creator of heaven and earth, just as what we see in the book of beginnings, Genesis chapter 1. And what we should gather, even through the testimony, the story of Job here, is that angelic beings did in fact witness the creation of the world, and that they rejoiced at the glory and the wisdom and power of God in his creation. And since God said that all the sons of God shouted for joy, we can take from this that Lucifer fell down from his exalted position after God created the earth. And, that is a question that there's a radio program when I have it on our local Calvary Chapel channel that I listen to on the radio, because half the time Caleb doesn't, play people I like. They have preaching on the channel. They have one show that's a question and answer show. And sometimes I just like to tune into the Q&A sessions that they have. And this is one of the questions that people always have is, did Satan fall before God created the earth or after? So, through Job, we can take that Lucifer fell down from his exalted position after God created the earth. In verse 8 through 11, it says, or who shut in the seas of doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? When I made the clouds in its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, when I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors, when I said, this far you may come, but no farther, and here your proud waves must stop. So God is also sovereign creator of the sea. And God's power over the sea by raising the continents is described, along with the thick clouds that drew up its water to carry rain to the land. So we see in the book of Job the process of evaporation, where the water rises up to go rain somewhere else takes place. And the beginning of the ocean is described in terms of giving birth. And Job had no understanding of how God set the boundaries for the seas. And he knew such boundaries existed, but he couldn't explain how or why exactly they were set. In verse 12 through 18, it says, have you commanded the morning since your days began, and caused the dawn to know its place, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, and that the wicked be shaken out of it? It takes on form like clay under a sail, and stands out like a garment. From the wicked their light is withheld, and the upraised arm is broken. Have you ever entered the springs of the sea? Have you walked in search of the depths? Has the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the doors of the shadow of death? Have you comprehended the breadth of the earth? Tell me if you know this. So God is sovereign over day and night. And dawn rises and it spreads light over the earth. It exposes the wicked like shaking the corners of cloth exposing dirt. In verse 14, clay under a sail. That was documents written on clay tablets were signed by personal engraved seals upon which was written upon the bearer's name. And it conveys the idea that the earth is turned or rotated like a cylinder sail rode over the soft clay. And such rolling cylinder sails were found in Babylon. And so these verses, they speak of the earth rotating on its axis. And an amazing statement that only God could reveal in the ancient days, because science at this time period would not have known that. You know, that knowledge came through science many years later. And the dawn rose across the earth as it rotates. And in verse 15, their light is the light of the wicked. That is darkness, because that's when they do their works. And it probably makes sense to you, but most crime, when people are looking to be thieves and burglars and everything else, most crime takes place when it is nighttime and dark out. And the dawn takes away from their opportunity to do their deeds and stop their arm lifted and ready to harm. And was Job around when God created light? That was another question that God asked Job. And Job's limitations are further exposed by listing locations that he has never explored: the depths of the sea, the realm of the dead, and the wide expanse of territory throughout the earth. So Job has never been 2.5 miles under the sea. Right now we are in 2024, and mankind is still trying to explore the ocean. And I think I read somewhere that about 90% of the ocean has been unexplored by man. And we can build technology and everything, but you guys might remember that submersible, the Titan or whatever, last September, I think it was, that went down to go look for the Titanic. A bunch of rich guys that wanted to see the Titanic. Their submarine exploded, or, you know, it pretty much, you know, vanished. We want to see the depths of the sea, but we don't have that power. Yet God knows everything of his creation, even the depths of the sea. And so verse 19 through 24 says, "Where is the way to the dwelling of light? And darkness, where is its place? That you may take it to its territory, that you may know the path to its home. Do you know it because you were born then? Or because the number of your days is great? Have you entered the treasury of snow? Or have you seen the treasury of hail, which I have reserved for a time of trouble, for the day of battle and war? By what way is light diffused, or the east wind scattered over the earth?" So light and darkness are personified as living in houses, but Job doesn't know where, or he can't tell where the sun goes when it sets. And verse 21 says, "Do you know it because you were born then, or because the number of your days is great?" So verse 21 is irony to show Job wasn't present when these aspects of creation were instituted. And only God is eternal. And the storehouses of the elements is the clouds. And Job doesn't know how snow or hail begin. And they are viewed as kept in divine storehouses and released by God as a means of intervention in earthly affairs. And the light in verse 24 is best understood as lightning, since this section focuses on weather. And the east wind is a storm wind coming from the desert. And many times in the Bible, we see hail is seen as catastrophe. It's seen as missiles and bombs, you know, in kid language, coming down from heaven against those hostile toward him and his people. And hail is often a tool of judgment against God's enemies, as you can find in Egypt back in Exodus 9:24, the Canaanites in Joshua 10:11, apostate Israel in Isaiah 28 verse 2, Gog and Magog in Ezekiel 38 verse 22. And verse 25 through 30 says, "Who has divided a channel for the overflowing water, or a path for the thunderbolt, to cause it to rain on a land where there is no one, a wilderness in which there is no man, to satisfy the desolate waste, and cause to spring forth the growth of tender grass? Has the rain a father, or who has begotten the drops of dew, from whose womb comes the ice, and the frost of heaven who gives it birth. The water hardens like stone, and the surface of the deep is frozen. So again, God puts Job in place by stressing who's in control of rain and ice. And nature doesn't exist simply for mankind. Verse 31 through 33, can you bind the cluster of the Pleiades, however that is, or loose the belt of Orion? Or can you bring out Mazzaroth in its season? Or can you guide the great bear with its cubs? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you set their dominion over the earth? So stellar constellations are in view. In verse 33, ordinances of the heavens are the laws and powers that regulate the heavenly bodies. And God alone has dominion over cosmic forces. And the Mazzaroth is an unknown constellation, and we see that God shows Job that he's omniscient, that man is not. Continue in verse 34 through 38. Can you lift up your voice to the clouds, that an abundance of water may cover you? Can you send lightnings, that they may go and say to you, here we are? Who has put wisdom in the mind? Who has given understanding to the heart? Who can number the clouds by wisdom, or can pour out the bottles of heaven? When the dust hardens in clumps and the clods cling together. So we see that God asked Job all the way through now if he has participated in creation, which is a crushing obvious answer of no, because Job had to be born as a man. So Job's inability to direct the rain and lightning further demonstrates the limitations of his power and knowledge. And verse 36 is the heart of the real issue. It says, who has put wisdom in the mind, or who has given understanding to the heart? You see, the wisdom of God, which created and sustains the universe, is at work in Job's suffering also. And it's interesting to consider that modern science has made amazing progress on answering some of these questions that God directed to Job. And that's because God has given the understanding at his time and place of choosing. And, science today can answer the measurements of the earth, the gravitational forces that keep the earth suspended, the meteorological and hydrological systems of the earth, the nature of light, and so on. Even though meteorology, they're not very good still, even with the technology they have in predicting 100% accuracy. But this increased knowledge is wonderful, and it's a glorious thing, and scientific inquiry is to be applauded. Could you imagine if we still lived a few hundred years back when we got a big snowstorm? I know we don't see the snow right now because I'm recording this video before we get a storm. But if we lived 300 years ago, we wouldn't know much about the storm, how much we're actually going to get. Now, there's different methods you can do. I can't remember exactly from my meteorology course, the old ways of determining weather. But with those methods, you can't determine how big the storm's going to be. You just know that, hey, this practice is showing there's a storm coming. And it's a wonderful fulfillment of our abilities as creatures made in the image of God that we can investigate and better understand the natural world around us. And in Proverbs 25 verse 2, it says, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings is to search out a matter. And yet with all this increased knowledge, as wonderful and glorious as it is, man still does not have the knowledge and wisdom of God. As a matter of fact, man thinks they're becoming wiser today, but they're becoming fools. And we see that through the denial of biology today in human anatomy. But we'll keep going here. And think how scientists have their theories also beyond just the bad biology that's becoming part of the new norm, or hate crimes. But think of how scientists have the theories of evolution, the Big Bang, and they don't know that there are only two genders. So verse 39 through 41 says, can you hunt the prey for the lion, or satisfy the appetite of the young lions? When they crouch in their dens, or lurk in the lairs to lie in wait, who provides food for the raven, when its young ones cry out to God and wonder about for lack of food? So now God draws Job on animal instincts, and here God once again reminded Job of the distance between them. So to wrap up today's video, I know this video went quite long, we see tonight that God finally speaks to Job from a whirlwind. And in verse 2 through 3, God shows Job to account. And we see that God questions Job regarding what he doesn't know. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to take a sip of water, because I don't think I usually talk this much. Verse 4 through 7 shows us that God asked Job if he knew the secrets of creation of the world. And in verse 8 through 11, God asked Job if he knew the boundaries of the sea. Verse 12 through 18, God asked Job if he understood the nature of the earth. And I want to go over to Luke chapter 11, verse 35. And it says here, therefore take heed that the light which is in you is not darkness. So as mentioned in verse 15, light of the wicked is darkness. Matthew 16:18. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. So the gates stand for dominion in verse 17. And the Lord is sovereign over the invisible realm, which the no longer person has seen. And in verse 19 through 24, we see that God challenges Job if he would comprehend the nature of light, darkness, and the sky. And we see the weather, we see hail discussed. And we talked about how hail throughout Scripture is a tool of judgment. And in Revelation 16, verse 20. Says that, then every island fled away and the mountains were not found. And great hail from heaven fell upon men, each hailstone about the weight of a talent. Men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, since that plague was exceedingly great. So hail is used on a rebellious earth in the Great Tribulation. And in verse 25 through 30, God asked Job if he understood the nature of rain and its effects. Verse 31 through 33 focuses on the nature of the constellations. Verse 34 through 38, God asked Job if he knew the nature of clouds, weather, and human mind. And we see that the chapter ends with the question of Job if he understood and mastered the animal kingdom. And one more verse I want to look at before we close out here is Matthew chapter 6, verse 26. Matthew 6:26 says, look at the birds of the air, for they neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not more value than they? So we know that God provides the food for the birds. And I know some of you might be a wise guy and be like, but I'm the one that goes to Tractor Supply and buy the bird seed to put in my bird seed feeder in the backyard. But, you know, God provides for his creatures. God provides, you know, the circle of life, if you want to call it that, for like wildlife, you know, prey and predators, all that in the woods. So I hope that you have a great rest of your day. We'll see you next as we look at God continuing to question Job. God bless.